On set now with us is Avi Hasson, Israel's chief scientist. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Natalie. Good to be here.
2015 was a strong year for the Israeli startup nation, with a record number of companies going public and also even exiting here. How would you rate the performance?
Well, absolutely, 2015 was a record year. When you look at the money raised by Israeli startups or venture firms, when you look at the number of mergers and acquisitions, when you look at the size of those acquisitions, you can see strong signs of the ecosystem and also a maturing of the Israeli high-tech scene.
What do you expect to happen in 2016? Similar trends here?
Well, it's obviously much harder to forecast the future than the past, and 2016 does seem like somewhat a challenging year in terms of the global economic markets when we look into what's happening in Silicon Valley and other places. Having said that, what we see is an ongoing flow of international investors and companies to Israel. So at least in terms of the Israeli high-tech scene, we're stronger than ever.
Well, you mentioned these companies that are maturing here, and often, time and time again, we've been hearing about Israeli companies selling out too soon. And now that we're seeing increasingly more and more unicorns here, do you think that that is a trend of the past?
Absolutely. I think we have both. Only this week we were announced of a fairly large Israeli acquisition, an Israeli company called Ravelo, acquired by Oracle for $500 million. That would be more of a typical mergers and acquisitions. And yet, only a month ago, we heard of an Israeli company, Mellanox, acquiring another company for $800 million companies. So we're seeing both. And I think more and more unicorns are starting to emerge in the Israeli scene, mostly headed by seasoned entrepreneurs. These are people who've already done one or two companies. They have the patience, they have the knowledge, and they're really aiming high.
Right, and that company that you mentioned specifically, they have 8 different companies that they founded, what I've researched from them. And just moving on here, though, as part of your job, essentially as an ambassador for the startup nation, you must travel frequently to San Francisco, to the Silicon Valley area. We have been hearing reports, though, that the activity there is cooling. Is that trickling at all over here to the Israeli startup scene?
Well, Silicon Valley is obviously an important place in terms of the Israeli scene, but over the last year, we've been diversifying our collaboration. And one of the interesting things about 2015 was really that it was also a record year for our relationships with places like China. Over $500 million invested by Chinese investors in Israeli company last year. Mergers and acquisitions, again, and this is not just China, it's Asia in general. So while we closely look at Silicon Valley to see what's happening there, we're really trying to diversify not only our target markets, but also our partners for collaboration.
Right, we have seen a significant rise of investors coming from China, both high-end investors and also increasingly mid-level investors as well. What's their interest in Israel's startup scene?
Well, I think their interest is very similar to interest of European and American investors. They come here for the talent, they come here for the deal flow, they find here cutting-edge innovation, which is both important and relevant for the Chinese market in its needs as a scaling up economy, but also just good investment. So I think once Israel was discovered, in a sense, by the Asian investors, and this is not just China, by the way, it's Japan and India and Korea and Singapore, the flow is really amazing.
Right, we're also hearing on a similar token here, these countries are very interested in learning about Israel's startup ecosystem and learning what lessons they can from this ecosystem and applying it to their own. What is Israel doing? How are they collaborating with countries like India and China to help them with their startup ecosystems?
Well, Natalie, I think on a weekly basis, I host delegations of foreign governments from Australia to Canada, from Japan to Chile, trying to learn what we've done around our innovation policies and schemes, like the Office of Chief Scientist. So it's something we do on an ongoing basis. And we're always happy to share perspective and help those countries scale up what they're doing. I think there's a growing understanding, and this year in Davos, it was seen once again, how much innovation is a driver of economic growth. And this is why governments worldwide try to understand what makes the ecosystem tick and, at least learn from the Israeli experience, which is seen as a very successful one.
Certainly, we've seen innovation being a very popular name here. Even cities that were typically focused on finance, like New York, also trying to stimulate their own innovation economies there as well. So that is interesting that you point out. But another trend that we're also seeing at the same time, governments and NGOs increasingly calling to boycott Israel. And how does that impact the startup scene here?
Well, I must say that so far, at least, it had very little impact on the strength of the ecosystem. As I've said, 85% of the money raised by Israeli startups come from foreign investors. All the mergers and acquisition, all the collaboration is actually done with global partners. And this remains strong, actually stronger than ever. Having said that, it's obviously not a positive trend, and we always like to separate business from politics.
Interesting. And, well, what thoughts do you have now going into 2016, just on a final note?
Well, I think from our side, we just like to see the Israeli high-tech scene staying competitive and really address some of our longer-term challenges. The more we have a mixed portfolio of startups on one hand, multinational companies on the other hand, but also those unicorns, as you call them, the larger, growing to be established companies in Israel, I think the stronger we'll be in the years to come.
All right. Well, thank you so much for bringing this insight to us. Avi Hasson, very much appreciate it.
Thank you.